So good day, friends. This is Dr. Bob Hamilton, and you have tuned in today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Before we start, I want to say thank you for checking in today with us. It means a lot to me. I do my best to bring relevant and important people in front of you on a weekly basis, and today is no exception to that. But if you like what you hear, and I hope you do, I would ask that you pass it on to friends and family. I want people to hear that the people that I bring on. And today is actually a very, very important day. We're going to talk about an issue which is becoming, I don't know if it's becoming, but it seems to be more people more aware of it. It is ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, which is something that maybe you've heard about out there, or maybe you're concerned about that with your child. But to have this conversation, it's a pleasure to welcome to the Hamilton podcast, Mark Bertin. He is a developmental behavioral pediatrician in private practice in Pleasantville, New York. He regularly blogs for Huffington Post, Psychology Today, and mindful.org. And he's also a father of two. He's an active practice as a developmental pediatrician back in New York. Dr. Mark Bertin, welcome to the Hamilton Review.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
It's my pleasure. And before we get going, I do have to acknowledge that you are the nephew of a good friend of mine, and I didn't know that until we just started talking. And so, Dr. Jeff Wasson, wherever you are, if you're listening to this conversation, I just a little shout out to Jeff Wasson. Love you, Jeff. You're a great guy. And I'm sure you feel the same way about your uncle.
Absolutely. So I spent a lot of time with him when I was living out near you guys. So
yeah, absolutely. So Dr. Bertin, before we start, I like to have my guests introduce themselves to the audience and just tell a little bit about your background, where you're from, what you're doing, how you ended up, your kind of your journey, and how you ended up doing what you're doing today. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to you, and Dr. Mark Bertin, go for it.
Thank you. Well, like you said, I'm right now practicing as a developmental pediatrician, about 45 minutes an hour north of New York City. And I really I got here because when I really grew up around the field of special education in many ways, and pediatrics. So I got my Uncle Jeff out there as a pediatrician, but the rest of my family are special education teachers. And when I was going through a hard time in high school, I started volunteering at Special Olympics, which got me involved with the sort of field I'm in. And I can't say it was so linear, but that was sort of got me on the path towards being a pediatrician, and thought about a couple other things, did a little general pediatrics. And then really after just a few years of general pediatrics, saw that this was the specialty that I was most called for. So went back to fellowship, and now for a really long time, this specialty of developmental behavioral pediatrics is all that I've been doing. So I haven't done general pediatrics in quite a number of years. So yeah, so I love what I'm doing. It's a lot like being a psychologist a lot of the time, more than a traditional or a straight ahead medical model, which is great for me. So
Sure. No, I will tell you, and I said this before, that developmental pediatricians are very unique and very special people, and they're hard to find. Here in Los Angeles, we have a handful of phenomenal people. They have a tendency to be booked up for a long time.
Yep.
And so I am sure you are booked up for a long time back there in New York, especially as we wind down this pandemic. I'm sure that has only increase the demand on your time. So, Mark, I thank you for actually spending your precious moments with us on this podcast. It means a lot to me. So, in addition, I want to also introduce Mark's book. Mark wrote a book called Mindful Parenting for ADHD. It is published by Harbinger is the name, and you can get it on Amazon. This is how I got my copy of the book. His subtitle is A Guide to Cultivating Calm, Reducing Stress, and Helping Children Thrive. Again, the name is Mindful Parenting for ADHD. We'll get back to that in a second. But Mark, before we dive into the topic, I want to know why you wrote the book, first of all.
I wrote the book for a couple of different reasons, I think complementary ones, I hope. But on the one hand, I think there's just so much misunderstanding and misinformation around ADHD out there. One thing I should say before we start, by the way, is you alluded to it, but didn't say specifically. When we talk about ADHD today, that really includes what is often talked about as ADD. So, it's really one big umbrella now where it's ADHD, the more inattentive type, ADHD, the more hyperactive type. But for anyone who's listening, we're really talking about the same topic. So on the one
Right.
hand, I feel really passionate about just getting practical evidence-based information out to the world in a way that it's understandable. And I think if you're going to manage something like ADHD well, you really have to understand what it is. And there's just a lot of confusion out there. And I think a lot of misguided information out there. So part of it was trying to be practical about the concrete evidence-based side of managing ADHD, help in a way that hopefully helps parents get on top of it, helps kids get on top of it. And then the mindfulness part of it was really a recognition that I think it's way under addressed that parenting kids with developmental differences like ADHD is really exhausting and stressful and just difficult for many, many reasons. On a practical level, kids with ADHD are behind in the skills that allow them to be independent, which just puts more demands on parents until we kind of catch up and get a handle on ADHD. And so I really wanted to offer something that helps parents feel resilient because I think that's a vicious cycle that isn't really talked about enough. When parents start feeling swamped and overwhelmed, obviously it's harder to just do the things that you're being asked to do day to day in a way that's as skillful as possible. So I wanted to offer something that kind of both offered the practical information and offered some of the support so parents can feel, stronger and better themselves.
Yeah. No question. I deal with these parents, and I can tell you that they really are stressed, and they're looking for answers, and they're looking for a way to help their child succeed. My observation, and yours too, is that parents love their children dearly. They want to do well by them. They want their kids to thrive in this world, and whatever they can do, if they come to you with a real need. I want to talk about the parents. Your book is written to parents, but I want to also back up a little bit and have you define ADHD. How would you define it if, in terms of the bigger picture, some of the common manifestations of it, and maybe
Mhm.
some of the uncommon manifestations?
Sure. I think the most important way to understand ADHD, the way we understand it now, is that it's actually a developmental disorder. There's a really large skill set that we all have to develop called executive function, which is kind of like our self-management skills. So one way to shorthand executive function is almost anything you can put the word management to in life probably includes a lot of executive function. We have to manage our attention, but then as we get older, we have to manage behavior and manage projects and manage emotions and manage relationships. So anything that requires that higher level of coordination and planning inherently involves executive function. But if you look at executive function like a skill set, which I don't think we like, there's many different implications of this, even in typical development. We don't really look at it. We don't give kids time to grow up on some level sometimes because executive function is supposed to develop gradually. And in fact, it's a very new understanding of brain development to recognize that these self-management skills mature only in our mid-20s. So typical human development begins at kindergarten age and, well, actually begins even earlier than that, but on a practical level for this kind of stuff is like preschool, kindergarten. You need a little executive function to get by in life. You don't want to be knocking kids down all the time. And then, it has to gradually mature until you're in your mid-20s. So it's kind of intuitive when you think about it. One of the examples I sometimes give is if you, have a bunch of kindergartners and have them like play, they're in a restaurant, they probably can, logistically list a lot of the things that have to happen, but obviously, they couldn't begin to even get a meal on the table. And then at 15, most kids can probably get a meal on the table, but you still probably wouldn't want most of them to run a restaurant because that level of coordination and planning is out of their developmental, wheelhouse. And then, by your mid-20s, that's the sort of job many people have. So let's sort of loosely trace this path of executive function.
Right. So,
And
I joke about this a lot. Are men behind women on the full
uh,
development? Because they say that men don't actually get there until they're about 25, and
um,
so I'm curious your thoughts about that. It seems like women do mature a little
Um,
bit earlier than men. Maybe that's just my observation and not the truth.
I hear that from the audience every time I give this talk, but really practically from a research point of view, it's like a trend, but not anything statistically all that important. Like most people mature in their mid-20s, maybe, women a little ahead of men, but really practically it's pretty similar overall. There's other differences that are going on clearly. But that isn't actually a huge difference. In fact, the incidence of ADHD is pretty similar across everybody. It's just it shows up differently in males versus females a lot of the time. Um,
Yeah,
but the one thing I haven't said yet that really ties this to your question about ADHD is that, the simplest way to understand ADHD is that it is a developmental delay in executive function. And one thing that's important to understand about the diagnosis of ADHD, because again, this is where the misunderstandings start undermining things, is that part of the diagnosis, there's a big bell curve of typical development. And part of the diagnosis of ADHD has to be that you're far enough behind that you're chronically causing yourself a problem. Without that chronic impairment of some kind, you probably could be in the range of like some people are a little more organized than other people, or some people are a little more focused than other people, and all of that's true. But
yeah,
at any age, you shouldn't be chronically doing something that's undermining your own well-being. And that's really what it means to look for a diagnosis of ADHD nowadays. So your executive function skills in some way or another, it's different for everybody. It's a very wide-ranging skill set. So ADHD looks really different for different people, is chronically undermining things. And that could be, you asked what it can, look like at different ages. Obviously almost the stereotype is the more behavioral issues that can come up, like impulsivity and misbehavior on that level. But actually on the, when you look at the diagnosis of ADHD, it gets overdiagnosed in misbehaving kids, but it often gets underdiagnosed in kids who are actually successful on the surface. So there's another group of people with ADHD who may be kind of pushing through their executive function difficulties, perfectly well behaved, maybe even getting reasonable grades, but because of
yeah.
their chronic challenge was organization, planning, time management, and all those kind of internal skills, are really suffering and struggling anyway. Everything's taking them 10, 15 times the effort it should to get to the same place.
Right. You make a very good point in your book about how ADHD affects real life. That's how you
Mhm.
put it in your book, and I like that because I think that ultimately, I think there are a lot of people who kind of flirt with who are kind of on the fringes of this diagnosis who function okay. I mean,
Mhm.
they're doing okay. They're living life. They're not maybe living life optimally, and maybe it is detracting from them. But those kids obviously ultimately, thankfully, they mature. You made the point that about half of all kids who are diagnosed with ADHD grow out of it
Mm.
as they get older. Is that still your feeling?
No, no. I don't think I think at the time the book was published, there was some question that up to about a third, there was some debate about whether up to a third of kids with ADHD might outgrow it, but really the research, if anything, has gone away from that. And there's actually less of a sense that most people outgrow, or even that percentage of kids outgrow ADHD. And the real
Hmm.
important thing to recognize about the impact of ADHD is the research is really showing it's much wider than we used to thought. So Russell Barkley published a study just in the last few years suggesting that undermanaged ADHD is a health disorder. And if that seems counterintuitive, it's not because it's directly affecting your health. It's because ADHD puts you at risk for everything else, on the life insurance tables that puts your health at risk. So if you undermanage ADHD, you're more likely to be, have, I mean, everything, obesity, you're at risk for alcoholism, you're at risk for driving accidents, you're at risk for, sedentary lifestyle. So that can be an overwhelming thing to hear, but the key point to me is undermanaged ADHD is widely impactful. It impacts relationship, it impacts all these different things.
Yeah,
The reason to address ADHD is because two things. I mean, even if you're fortunate enough to outgrow it or feel you've outgrown it, all of childhood may have passed by then. And secondly, even if you're doing well in school, it's often impacting these other areas of life, and it gets subtler and subtler because since ADHD is the executive function is the goal setting part of your mind, your thought process. ADHD can really affect, many aspects of life. Kids with ADHD often have a hard time, for example, just like sticking to the practicing that would make them thrive in their avocations and their hobbies, like shooting free throws or playing violin or all these other things. Anything in life can be important to anybody individually. And ADHD really can affect any of it if you don't get on top of it.
Yeah, it undercuts, undermines. You mentioned that it decreases the ability to learn routines.
Mhm.
It results in inconsistent performance, social immaturity, which is a big thing, apparent lack of motivation. That's a big one. I sometimes would this be one of those situations where you might miss the diagnosis? Just kids who procrastinate, they don't seem motivated,
Right.
and they are just not good at time management. Maybe
Yeah.
some of these kids may not manifest in school, but they're certainly not thriving in life.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple. I mean, that's one of a couple different ways ADHD can be really easily missed. One of the things that comes up all the time for me that I think we underestimate is that, motivation itself is more complicated than it seems. It's not just, it's like suddenly we can start like lifting pianos for a living just because we're highly motivated to lift pianos. You have to have the motivation and some sort of physical skill, right? So you gotta like, there's a skill attached to the motivation to succeed in life across almost anything. You can look at reading that way. You can look at a sport that way. You have to can do both. And when it comes to school, primarily, not primarily, but often primarily for kids, it's not just that you have to be motivated. You have to be able to like organize and plan and manage your time. And many people estimate ADHD is like a 1/3 delay in executive function skills. So you can easily be, 15 in high school and have a 10 or 11-year-old's ability to manage your time and manage your stuff. And that could look like poor motivation because you get distracted enough task and don't get to your work until too late, when really it's actually a skill that's behind. You're really behind in your executive function. And then the other really huge reason ADHD gets missed is that executive function skills are used increasingly when demands go up. So if something's totally easy and in your wheelhouse and you love it, it doesn't really put a lot of demand on executive function. So you may look like, one of the really common ones nowadays is like, how come you can focus on your video games, but you can't focus on your math? And in reality, that's because video games don't demand any real attention. That's how they're designed. And
Yeah.
math requires effort. And so it looks like you're choosing to focus on one and not the other, when in reality, what's going on is when the demands go up, if you have ADHD, you can't sort of rally the executive function to manage a more difficult task. And then that leads to a different spiral where you're often getting blamed for something that really isn't fully under your control.
So yeah, I see that. That's a classic kind of thing. The parents will say he can sit there and watch TV and not move
Right,
for an hour,
right,
and yet when I ask him to do his math, he can't settle
right.
down. So I obviously watching TV and being entertained is a very passive phenomenon.
Correct.
It's
Well,
not an active.
yeah, there's even another subtlety to that, which is video games in particular, but TV, anything you can sort of rapidly sort of channel surf or move your attention around, or, if you really look what's going on, the cognitive side of that isn't focused attention at all. It's a very choppy, fast-paced attention. That's what makes it fun in essence. So you
Yeah,
look like you're really focused, but you're actually not focusing on anything for any length of time. It's not like you're watching like a nature show where you have to keep focused for an hour for most kids. So really, when I ask people to sort of reflect on their kids' attention, unfortunately, you almost have to put aside the one or two things they find most pleasurable in life, because those aren't putting demands on executive function. So
yeah.
it's like,
So this is an aside, but it
yeah,
kind of brings up a point. More and more shows that are directed to children, the camera only lingers for seconds, as opposed to
correct.
like the old days, like a
Hmm.
Mr. Rogers
Yeah,
example, where
yep,
the camera would just, he would have a conversation, and it was just
right.
one camera looking at Mr. Rogers for minutes at a time. Your thoughts, is that this are we creating ADHD by our, I mean, I watch some videos, for example, and it's almost like you get boom, boom, boom.
Right, right.
The images are changing so quickly.
Mhm.
Any thoughts about that?
Oh, totally. Yes, that's another big passion of mine. But there's a nuance there, which is you're exacerbating ADHD and you're exacerbating attention problems. But So I don't know that the so two different things. The actual rate of ADHD is actually pretty stable over time, and stable over cultures and different parts of the world. It's around 1 out of every 15 kids everywhere you look. However, there certainly is research showing that, or suggesting at least, that fast-paced shows like that, because of there's a aspect of brain development called neuroplasticity, which is the brain rewires itself based on experience, certainly impact attention and executive function, at least on some level. There's a great researcher, I think, out of Washington named Dimitri Kostakis, who's done a lot of talks and a lot of research on this, and it impacts things. I mean, there was one study done many years ago that's often talked about. I get myself in trouble. I'll also say it compares I won't name the cartoon itself. I don't want anyone getting angry about the cartoon, but it looks at a very mainstream famous cartoon compared to PBS, compared to an arts project, and shows measurable changes in executive function after 10 minutes of watching the cartoon, whereas there's no change on the PBS video and the crafts project. So there is, I think societally there is certainly an influence of in countless different ways on attention and emotion and well-being and body image from the way technology is being used and presented to our kids nowadays. I think it's part of the public health crisis and mental health we have going on right now. Although, obviously it's not the only thing, but it's certainly a significant part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. You wonder what is it that's causing this explosion of emotional and all these issues. I mean, obviously the pandemic, we blame everything on the pandemic, but I think there are other
It's not
forces
there.
involved.
Yeah, there was other stuff going on before the pandemic, and social media is
Yeah.
certainly a big front and center one. But there's also just the fact that the way technology is being used to this point in time, hopefully we can start pushing back a little bit. It has its direct effect, which could be on attention and executive function, certainly on emotion and well-being. Social media has been shown to have such detrimental effect on kids, but also it more and more replaces the activities that we know are healthy for kids. So it's taking away from exercise and outdoor time and face-to-face time with friends and reading and all these things that have been shown to be beneficial for mental health. So it has both effects, both its direct effect and the fact that it's replacing other healthier things, almost for certain. Oh,
So
to tie it to
one
today's
of the
talk,
one of the
can I just have one more sentence to tie it to today's talk
oh,
too?
sure,
Be-
yeah.
because executive function is the reason, excuse me, is the skill set used to manage this type of stuff. The kids we're talking about today with ADHD have, substantially harder time than their peers managing technology. So if kids have ADHD, this becomes even a huger issue for sure. I was on an advocacy call this week, which was for trying to get some legislation passed around technology. And it was sort of open call for anyone to come speak. And it was amazing. Probably 3/4 of the parents who showed up all had kids with ADHD, because it is so hard for kids with ADHD to manage this kind of thing.
No, I tell parents, I mean, listen, you got to pull back on the screen time. And they say when we try to do that, our kids have the most terrible temper tantrum,
Yes,
and
yes.
it's almost not worth it. And maybe that's what half the problem is.
Yeah.
Changing subjects a little bit. You
Please.
mentioned in your book this idea of processing disorders, which
Mhm.
I think is a relatively new concept in the pediatric world. Certainly, something that I, in my training, never really
Yeah.
encountered.
Yep.
We talk about auditory processing, visual tracking processing, sensory processing disorders. Can you speak to that briefly?
Sure. I mean, the short of it is that for the most part, that's all of the processing disorders are relatively theoretical still. There isn't a lot of hard science behind them. And it depends which ones you're talking about. I mean, a lot of the visual, I mean, I will defer to this. There's an American Academy of Pediatrics statement about visual processing, and the research really showing it does not have much to do with education at all. So instead of fighting that fight, I'll just refer people to it, because, basically, uh, uh, most often that's talked about in terms of reading, and there is no visual component to reading apart from being able to see the page. When it comes to executive function and auditory processing, basically the executive function is the part of your brain that you use to process information as it comes in. So the reason processing disorders aren't really in the textbooks on that level is because they, as at this point in time, are most often symptoms of other things. So kids who get labeled as having auditory processing typically have executive function issues or language issues, and the interventions for auditory processing have not been shown to help, with anything in the real world a whole lot. And sensory processing is probably the most complicated one because kids can have sensory issues. But again, from a textbook point of view, they're often seen as like the endpoint. They're not the cause of what's going on. They're a symptom of what's going on. So they're certainly worth addressing if you can prove they're going on. But they're very rarely, if ever, causal. They're a piece
Yeah.
of some other diagnosis typically. I mean, that's my take, on the short version of that.
No, I always, when people ask me about these things, and there's a whole industry which is being, devoted to the caring for these kind of
Right.
issues, but I always kind of go, I don't know the outcome of some of the therapies that are being
Right.
utilized, put it that way. Anyway, I want to get a little bit to the point of your book, which you talk about the care of the caretaker.
Mhm.
And you mention in your book that ADHD is totally stressful for families,
Mhm.
stresses the parents, is very disruptive to a family, is very consuming, stresses marriages, of course. And the other thing you mentioned is that people feel judged.
Mhm.
Parents feel judged by other people. So you're addressing this book to parents of children with ADHD,
Mhm.
and I would like you to speak to that because that's a big
Sure.
that's kind of where
Absolutely.
your book is what your book is all about.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two sides that I'm hoping to, help parents with. And one we started with, which I'll just mention, but I do want to say, obviously we're going to talk about mindfulness in a second. It's in the title, but the whole concept, even though it's packaged in lots of kind of open-ended ways, is really just to see life with as much clarity as you can so you can manage as well as you can. So one thing I want to say when we start talking about taking care of parents is the more accurately you can look at what ADHD is and what interventions work, that certainly is a long way to making your child feel better, but also you feel better.
Yeah,
And they're sort of hand in hand because on a practical level, to look at interventions for ADHD, you have to recognize that it is a delay in independence. So a lot of the solutions do rely on parents. It's another way parents, the demands go up on parents. But that's really
yeah,
important to acknowledge. There's a list of things that we know can be effective for ADHD, and some are medical and some are not medical. And it's some combination of those that on a practical level, are in the book and are going to help you get a handle on ADHD. And then on the other side of it, which is I think what you're alluding to, is there just isn't enough discussed, I think, in general, of how just demanding this is and how exhausting this is to be, I mean, it's first of all, it's frustrating and can make you sad as a parent if your child's struggling. I mean, that's a piece of it. The demands go up because you have to be more in control. ADHD, by the way, is a planning disorder. So like the kids are the last ones on board to be able to manage their own ADHD. It's just a natural part of the process. Like part of the
yep,
intervention is trying to get them to the point they can do it themselves, but it's going to be, morning routines and homework are all going to put more demands on parents there too. And then the judgment part of it is not trivial when you're getting, like you feel like your own parents are looking at you funny, or people in the restaurant, or, the school keeps calling you because of these struggles. It's all really exhausting. And the thing about that is that ADHD, requires a lot of clear-sightedness and resilience just to manage it. But, if we're sort of wiped out and shot as parents, that just makes it that much harder to do any of that.
yeah,
And as hard as it is, and as almost cliched as it is to say it, there's just a reality that we have to take care of ourselves enough that we can be strong enough to support our families. And really, the whole practice of mindfulness and as a whole, like I found it very effective myself, and I use it all the time. And but to some level, the message isn't, so the book itself talks about mindfulness, but it's really whatever
yeah,
individually for you, everybody has whatever keeps them strong. And it's just a matter of really, carving out a place for at least one or two things that keep your feet on the ground, but your children are going to benefit. And I do think, that isn't talked about enough in this whole big picture of raising kids. I mean, that's just inherently part of any family to me.
yeah. Uh, and that leads into the this conversation, mindfulness. Can you first of all Dr. Bertin, can you actually maybe define in your mind's eye what mindfulness really is?
Sure. And I always do it in two parts because there's like the textbook definition and then there's what it really means on a practical level. So the textbook definition is just aiming to give life objective and compassionate, our objective and compassionate awareness while it's happening. Right? That's a mouthful, but I often encourage people when I start talking about mindfulness, like ask yourself, is it true? That's a very early teaching around mindfulness I find really useful. Like be skeptical, really look, like, is it practical that, we can only handle problems better, we can only get the most out of life if more often than not we're trying to pay full attention to what's going on. So on
Right.
a practical level, what the practice of mindfulness is, it isn't a meditation practice specifically. It's just trying to recognize that when we're off balance and stressed and caught up in all this scary stuff going on in the world and we get lost in that, we tend to be on a kind of reactive autopilot. We're just doing the same things we always are doing, saying the things, we're just not aware of what's going on a very specific level. We are in a very gut level, maybe, or at a big picture level. But if you want to handle homework differently or have a different conversation with someone when you've been having the same fight about homework for all these years, or have a different teacher meeting, whatever it is, if we want to handle a situation more precisely, we have to be able to train ourselves to develop a little sense of patience and awareness so that we can navigate whatever it is that's happening as skillfully as we can. So the practice of mindfulness isn't any one thing in particular, but it's kind of like a gym program almost. It's like actively choosing to break the stress cycle, to learn to develop a little patience with discomfort, and also overlaps directly with ADHD care. Because on the more positive side, when you look at like the average, or really not the average, all behavioral programs with ADHD, they always start with, in the middle of all the troubles that are going on, try to give your children positive attention and try to catch them being good and give them praise when they're successful. And that may seem straightforward, except in the average chaotic day, it isn't so straightforward. Like when you're trying to run out the door and there's 100 different things going on, you kind of take for granted the fact that your child may have done 5 things that they needed to get out the door before they left with no pants on. And then you say, like, what the hell are you doing? Go back in and get your pants on. But that's the first thing they've heard from you. So this
Yeah.
practice of mindfulness is one of just being aware enough during the chaos to say, like, hey, nice job
Yeah.
brushing your teeth. And, nice job getting your lunch in the bag. And then the correction's still real too. That might have to happen. Pants are better for school. But you got to do all of that. So the practice of mindfulness is one of just seeing things as realistically as possible so we can manage them. But that takes, practice and effort because that's not how life pushes us. Life pushes us instead into just like this sort of stress cycle and reactivity otherwise. So that's
Yeah.
really what the practice of mindfulness is. It's this long-term practice of trying to develop traits that make life a little easier to live.
Right. I think about it as being in the moment, that you're
Mhm.
actually paying attention, you're actually living life in
Right.
real time. And listen, Dr. Burton, I think we all, especially as we age, there are so many things which are coming at us. I think
Mhm.
about the number of pieces of mail, the emails, all of the messages I receive in a day. Sometimes I'm amazed by how many things I have to actually deal with, and
Mhm.
sometimes those clutter your mind. When I'm with patients, I have to look at them, and I have to, just like you have to
Right.
look at them and focus, and you have to be thinking about what they're that situation. So I think that in that regard is being in the moment is certainly critical when you're trying to parent a child who is maybe not who's dealing
Right.
with ADHD.
So, right. And you actually are bringing up a second. So mindfulness practice is often described, one metaphor that sometimes is used is like two wings on a bird. And I think actually you've alluded to both of them because on the one hand, absolutely, it is a useful practice, and you can get better at noticing when during the day you really have to notice that I'm distracted and come back. When I teach my
Yeah,
doctor programs, we often call it a doorknob practice. It's like every time you put your hand on a doorknob, just catch yourself for a moment, notice wherever your attention happened to have been, and then bring your attention to whatever, the next, whatever's about to happen, the next person you're about to talk to. And you want to do that regularly because it ties to the second thing, which is like this is all very realistically about imperfection too. It's not that anybody is ever always calm and we can't stop our minds from thinking, and we're not trying to strive for something impossible. We're just trying to improve a little bit. So the second half of the practice is actually one of, directly developing that sense of patience and kindness with ourselves as well as with other people, and just recognizing, like, as a parent, for example, it's so easy to feel like, I'm doing this so badly and I can't believe I said that. And if only I had gotten on top of this 4 years ago, and all this inner critic, self-judgmental stuff just undermines how we feel and our resilience. And beginning to work with that is also part of the practice, just
Yeah.
recognizing that our inner dialogue, and this is beginning to sound like a lot to cover in a short interview because it's a much bigger, it's a hard topic to make feel realistic in 2 sentences, but it's real that we tend to be far more critical of ourselves than we are with other people. And there's this research, particularly out of the University of Austin, Kristen Neff, who's shown that our own resilience improves as well as how we treat other people if we can begin to change that inner dialogue a little bit. And not that it's all good, like we all have stuff to work on too. It's like, but just that we can sort of shift a little bit more towards we would actually talk to like a young child or our best friend. And that's inherently part of the practice too, because if you just push for like in the moment all the time, you're going to burn yourself out even more, like you're just trying to
Yeah.
do a little better, really.
I think we all have those inner dialogues that go on in our brain
Right.
throughout the day, and we're thinking thoughts, and we are judging ourselves. And
Mhm.
sometimes, this idea of moving beyond that. Sometimes
Yeah.
it's hard to do. I have to say, there
Yes.
are days when I find myself extremely judgmental.
Yep.
Sometimes I screw up, and then I don't like it, and then I don't like myself at all. So a couple other questions, and I'm watching our time. I know that you're a busy guy back there, and I promise to get you out at a reasonable time. But do what is your thought? Medications. We haven't talked about medications.
Mhm.
Can you speak to that?
Well,
And do you think that all kids who have the diagnosis of
right.
ADHD need to be on medications?
Um, well, that's a perfect segue between the two parts of our conversation, because where else in the whole care of ADHD is there more sense of judgment and shoulding on ourselves and like, I shouldn't need medication. We shouldn't have to use this. We shouldn't have to use that. So I think I always think about that problem in 2 or 3 steps. I mean, ADHD, unfortunately, from the point of view of diagnosis at this point in time, is still just clinical medicine. We don't have a test for it. There's a ton of research showing that, though, that it is definitively a medical disorder. So the genetics of ADHD are as strong as the genetics of height, just about as strong as the genetics of height. Over groups of people with ADHD, there is plenty of brain-based research showing there are physical differences in the brain. So when it comes to the discussion of medications, this is like that sense of mindfulness, of like non-judgmental awareness of a situation. The ADHD medications have been around for 100 years. As far as we know, they are exceedingly safe, at least as safe as anything else being used in pediatrics. They're in and out of your system over hours. The management of them can be quite hard, but the actual success rate of ADHD medications is that somewhere around 80 to 90% of people can use ADHD medications without any significant side effects. Again, if you go through what can be a difficult trial and error period. And in the end, most people with ADHD end up trying medications. I mean, in the end, ADHD is a medical disorder. And just like high blood pressure, I'm perfectly open to people trying to manage it non-medically. Try exercise, try diet for high blood pressure. For ADHD, you can try the behavioral interventions and the school supports and all that. But the bottom line is that in spite of this is where it's just totally unfair to parents. The way I usually summarize it to parents is no one should use a medication for any medical disorder they don't need, but you shouldn't feel any more concerned about using the ADHD medications than any other medication. They
Yeah.
don't stunt growth and they actually decrease the risk of substance abuse. They don't increase the risk of substance abuse. All of the stuff that causes fearfulness in parents is just adding to that sense of judgment and stress when in the end, it's a hard enough situation without all that to just say, use the medications. If you think they might be helpful, stop them if they're not helping, and
Yeah.
so the bottom
I
line is that is an evidence-based recommendation that's incredibly helpful for many kids.
my feeling is this. I walk, I don't run the medications. I make sure that I talk to the right people. I talk to teachers. I try to get an idea
Hmm.
of how is this kid functioning out there in the real world. And obviously, we're not trying to put kids on medication, but when they need it, I can tell you, and people in my practice know, I tell them this, that when they do get it there, and you ask the kids, how are you doing? They will say, I think I'm doing better. I mean, they
Yeah.
themselves
It-
will tell
It's
you, they will
yeah,
testify that this has made a
right,
difference. The parents oftentimes look relieved a little bit,
right.
and ask me why I waited so long
Yeah,
sometimes.
yeah.
I'm not trying to be, I'm not trying to be difficult with parents, but I want to make sure the kids need it before I give it. And it does make a difference in their lives.
It certainly does. And although I would add, just as a caveat, but this comes up too, is that there are some kids who really, really don't see the benefits for a long time after they're already helping. And that's also just part of living with ADHD, is the kids are often the last ones to figure out what's going on, but everybody else will tell you the medications are helping. So, it's definitely, I'm with you in that I always tend to take things step by step, but there doesn't need to be such, fear and avoidance either. It shouldn't feel any, more challenging than treating any other medical disorder, really.
Yeah, yeah. Amen to that. Okay, I'm looking at our time. We're gonna end it there. I want to know, first of all, I want to reiterate the name of the book. The name of the book that Dr. Bertin has written. By the way, his name is spelled Mark, M-A-R-K, Bertin with an I, B-E-R-T-I-N, M-D. The name of the book is Mindful Parenting for ADHD. For those who are seeing this on our, there it is right there for people watching this on YouTube. Dr. Bertin, how can people find you?
The easiest way is through my website, which is developmentaldoctor, all spelled out.com.
Developmentaldoctor.com.
Yep.
That's a great, that's pretty easy. Way to go
Great.
to
Thank
shag
you.
that one down. Um, and friends, this is a very, very useful, helpful book. If you are dealing with ADHD in your children, this is something you should definitely pick up and read through. It's very readable. And I tell you, I learned a lot by reading Dr. Burton's book, so I recommend it to you. So with that, I want to sign off. Friends, thank you for tuning in today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. I can't think of a better collision that's happening out there with kids than with ADHD, which is a big issue, as we all know. So Dr. Burton, thank you for illuminating this issue for us. Appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. Take care.
It's great. And friends, thank you for tuning in. Until next time, be well. Bye-bye.
You have been listening to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of your day. Tune in again next week on Apple Podcast. Rate and comment and tell a friend.